Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Swine podcast. I'm your host, 𝘨𝘪𝘭𝘵, and with me today, I have Dr. Karl Kerns from Iowa State University, who's currently an assistant professor in the animal science department. Karl, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Good. Well, we're glad to have you on. Karl, some of our audience may not be familiar with who you are, so would you mind giving a little bit of a background as to where you came from and what got you to where you're at today?
Sure, exactly. So I was raised on a small swine seed stock operation in Southwest Iowa, some beef cattle as well, and then came up to Iowa State for my undergrad education during 2010 and 2014. Went down to University of Missouri for my doctoral studies in Boar reproductive physiology, looking more on the translational aspects and basic molecular aspects of what basic molecular research discoveries can we make, and then translate that into the field. Likewise, what's going on in the field that we need to have a deeper understanding at the molecular level. So then did my postdoc at University of Missouri in partnership with the med school there, and then came up here to Iowa State University for my current position.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think it's really interesting to have this conversation because I really feel like the boar is the forgotten animal in swine production. We don't have that many boars when we think about the number of animals that we have, whether it's in the US population or worldwide. And, we just kind of see them as a means to the end to get the piglets. And we know they have genetic value, but when we think about management and technology, I just don't feel like they get the same amount of attention. Do you feel the same way, or am I kind of off on that?
No, exactly. That's the case that we always make, especially when writing grants, is that we've done so much work on the gilt and sow side, but the other half of that equation is the boar side. And so Mashoff's published some really nice data last fall in Farm Journal's Pork magazine, doing single sire AI and showing how even though we can have normal motility and normal morphology over the 80% thresholds that we like to see, there's still about 25% of the boars that have less than 80% conception rates. So oftentimes we think motility and morphology is the answer to telling fertility, but it's almost like showing up to a workplace and sitting in a parking lot and watching people arrive to work and saying, I'm going to judge their ability to do their job today by arriving to work and how they walk to work. That's unfair to humans. We know that doesn't indicate how successful they'll be. And it's definitely not fair to boars. And so I think that's one reason we often overlook it, because we think it's so simple, but there is a lot more underneath the hood than we realize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I like the analogy. It was one I haven't thought of before. So what kind of things should we be maybe looking at? Or do we have any indications of, if it's not morphology, what it is?
Sure. So one, I don't want to discount motility and morphology. That's a bare minimum. So it's a prerequisite, just like showing up to work in the absence of remote work. We have methods to remote work, but you have to show up to do the job. So we definitely need the motility and the good morphology. But after that, there's multiple biomarkers we can look at the mitochondria. Are they producing the energy needed for the cell? Are the acrosomal membranes good? Is the plasma membrane good? Even like ion localization. So what's the zinc signature? What kind of pattern does the zinc look like? What does calcium ions look like? There's a whole range of different probes that we can look at that really give us a good understanding of the overall health of an individual sperm cell. And then we can look at it on a population basis of part of each ejaculate.
So is that something within an individual animal could change from time to time? So one collection is suitable and the next collection, maybe the zinc level is off. Is that a fair thing?
Yeah, for sure. So what we'll do oftentimes is run the sperm through an in vitro capacitation assay. So capacitation is the capacity to reach a fertilization functional state. And we'll see not only and before we do the in vitro capacitation, but then also after their ability to achieve a capacitated state, changes from ejaculate to ejaculate. Sometimes we have boars that have a high ability to reach a capacitated state, some that have a low ability, but then it's consistent versus inconsistent too. A lot of times we refer to seminal fluids as seminal plasma, which really is disingenuous because it infers that it's a homogeneous-like fluid, well-regulated, hemostatically regulated like blood plasma, but that could be anything further from the truth for seminal plasma.
Mm-hmm. So some of the techniques you're talking about to me sound like they could be a little bit time consuming. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm obviously not an expert in boar production either. And so I'm thinking about when I'm in a boar stud and I'm using a CASA machine or something where I'm doing a very quick analysis of the sperm cells, the items that you're talking about that we might need to further look at to understand those sperm cells, is that something that's readily available and can be done quickly, or is that something where they'd have to send off to a secondary lab?
Yeah, so there's both options available, but no doubt it is expensive equipment to have within a boar stud. The supplies are expensive, and then the labor, as well as we know the time, just the function of time. We don't have enough time in the boar stud when we're processing semen as it is. And so there are third-party labs all across the U.S. that can help with that. And also, it's possibly going on in the future good to validate boars before we introduce them into the final herd, so we have an understanding of should they be in the reproductive herd or not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's again too why we hear so much about, well, let's pool semen, right? So that we don't have to worry about maybe that animal for that individual collection. But yeah, I would agree, if we can get the rapidity of the analysis done right there on the boar stud, that would be really invaluable technology. Would it not be?
Yeah, exactly. But also on the pool side, it's been an insurance policy that we've taken out as an industry. But then we're also at the average of the pool, or even sometimes at the least common denominator of the pool as well. There can be factors present, whether proteins or other factors in the semen, that give us the average or the lowest fertility status of the boar in the pool. And so I think it was good for a time frame that we didn't understand boar fertility very good. We didn't have biomarkers readily available and whatnot. We'll eventually be to the point that we can predict an individual boar's fertility, and then even titrate the sperm dose down to how many cells need to be in this to get a certain percentage of conception rate. So I think that's a really exciting area in the future, that we can actually start titrating semen doses down to the effective dose size that we need. And this is really important for genetic leverage. I mean, when we looked at artificial insemination coming into the swine industry, we went from one boar servicing 30 sows to one boar servicing 300 sows. Some facilities now are up to 700, 750. And so if we can start using the higher premium genetics across more of the sow herd, and finish pigs quicker, have better feed efficiency, that's going to be helping move the swine industry in the direction we need to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people haven't, I mean, I think they understand, but maybe haven't really put the numbers to it to see what the economic return would be if we can expand those animals even further. And so certainly with things like PCAI, we've seen some of that technology at least allow us to do a better job. But what I'm hearing you say is that there's actually the potential to maybe even go lower in terms of sperm cell counts, but it might be based on individual animals rather than just a general statement. So that might be something to look for in the future, is how we breed animals might be different from animal to animal.
Yeah, and Dr. 𝘞𝗿𝗄𝗏 did some really nice work on this in the early 2010s, showing how each individual boar responds to the dose size differently. And so I think that's going to be a really exciting part in the future, and give something for us researchers to chase after.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when we think about where we're going, because you're talking about some exciting technology and some potential changes in the industry that might be, I'm guessing 10, 20 years down the road, maybe some of it.
Sure.
What do you see as the things as to where we're going in the next 5 to 10 years with our boars?
Yeah, so ultimately, it's nice how we can look at human research and human health sciences and apply it to the ag field. And we do it the other way around too, look at mRNA vaccines that we've used in the swine industry and using today. But particularly if we think about cancer diagnosis in humans, one of the new hot trendy things to do is looking at label-free detection techniques. And so what that means is where we would traditionally use a fluorescent biomarker that tells us a certain aspect for cancer detection, looking at that is cancer present or not. Simply looking at the bright field, how the image would look underneath a typical microscope, and using deep learning, artificial intelligence technology, so we don't have to have every biomarker actually present in the cell. We don't have to have very expensive equipment. We don't have to use a labor involved for that. And ultimately, on the same microscopes that we're doing daily motility analysis on, the CASAs, having this label-free technology borrowed from the cancer side, that we can look at a plethora of biomarkers without actually putting them in there. I think that's going to be a big step for the boar industry, and that'll be really pivotal for titrating the doses in the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Some of the other things I think we've heard a lot about as we continue down the discussion routes of antibiotic-free programs is certainly even antibiotics in semen extenders. And so where are we at on that as an industry?
For sure. So far, we've honestly been running underneath the radar of keeping antibiotics and extenders, but we know the time and day will eventually come. When we take out the antibiotics, we have a bacterial issue, of course. So the same ingredients that are needed for sperm cells to stay alive are also the ingredients to multiply bacteria. And so when we're storing semen before we AI the sow or the gilt, we're doing a nice job of keeping the sperm alive, but we're trying to manage the bacterial growth as well. And so inevitably, if we take those antibiotics out, we're going to have bacterial growth. There's only so much sanitation that we can do on the boar stud side. There is going to be bacteria present. So one of the newest ways of going about it that looks promising is really the hypothermic storage. And so storing the semen almost at a refrigeration-like temperature, lower than the traditional 15 to 17 degrees Celsius that we're seeing used today. And what that does is when the extenders are created to support the sperm survival at that standpoint, and there are extenders out there for that, but it decreases the ability for bacteria to grow. And so I think that's likely the strongest area that we have going on in the future at this moment for getting around the antibiotics.
Mm-hmm. So how would that look in a barn if I have them in a hypothermic state, and then I'm bringing them out? Would I have to have them in a warm water bath? Can I put them out on room temperature? Have we looked at that yet?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of research done on that. And I'll be honest, I haven't focused on that myself. I work more on the sperm biomarkers. But to my understanding, you can go straight into insemination and use it right away. Yeah.
Okay, well, that'd be very interesting then, because that middle step of having to warm it up, I think would be a little bit of a challenge on most farms. So I think if you could take it right out and put it into the sow, that would be very beneficial.
Yep, but we will see that there's a cool down curve that we have to follow appropriately for that. So we will have to change incubators out so that we can tell the incubator, hey, the semen has arrived, start gradually cooling it down. That is one of the big things that we'll have to change. Yep.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So as you know, nutrition's my passion. Is there anything on the nutrition front that we should be thinking about? So gosh, over the years, we've looked at so many different things in terms of fatty acids and particularly how do we address heat stress. And a lot of times it was, don't put anything fancy in the boar diets, keep them very simple because the boars are, of course, very sensitive to any changes that we make. And so try to keep it as constant for as long as possible. So anything that you're hearing out there in terms of boar nutrition that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I won't talk any product names per se, but just generally speaking, omega-3s are important. So sperm cells have quite a bit of lipids in them, and we don't know as much about the lipid profile in boar sperm that we should know. But we do know that certain lipid supplements will increase sperm production. Likewise, on the zinc side, we've known for centuries probably that zinc is a fertility boosting supplement. And for so long, we didn't know why. We eventually found out that zinc is a cofactor for testosterone, so we need that to increase our sperm cell counts. But then also at the molecular level, we're starting to understand how zinc plays a pivotal role in regulating fertilization competency. So zinc, lipids, and then it looks like there's people excited about some herbal supplements as well that might be increasing fertility and sperm cell counts as well.
Mm-hmm. How about for heat stress? Are we hearing anything that seems to be effective for heat stress? Because I know some of our listeners are in very hot parts of the world that
Yeah,
don't have the luxury of seeing a winter months like we would here.
for sure. So the easy answer is air conditioning. We're seeing more and more boar studs have air conditioning built, and so you can't just do traditional air conditioning that we would do in the homes. We have to do tandem air conditioning, where you have one air conditioner that cools down air outside of the building, starts to cool it down a little bit, and then a second air conditioner right after that to cool it down even more. Because in traditional HVAC systems, we're recirculating the air. The reason we can't do that in these barn situations is that we're going to start tearing up the coils and having a limited lifespan of those air conditioning units. Air conditioning is expensive though, and so there's definitely an economics to pencil out to all that. Some people have found that it works for their setup. Otherwise, there's new research being done, particularly by John Parrish. He's shown that PG 600 might be effective at decreasing some of the heat stress effects that we see.
Very interesting. Yeah, I know I've seen a few new facilities, particularly as we've moved into the positive pressure mode, being able to, of course, put those air conditioning units in. And I know they've been effective. I was just curious as to, if there's anything else or where the industry was currently thinking. So that's very interesting.
And I joke, there's quite a bit there's probably over 50% of the boars in the US that have a better climate in the summertime than a lot of office buildings do. So
boars are very well taken care of. That's
yes,
for sure.
Yes.
So as we think about those boars, I have lots of questions, and I've given some of our previous guests a hard time, because I look at it and I've done genetic studies and we talk indexing, and boy, indexing from one company is not the same as the other. And how do you start to measure things effectively, particularly at the production level, so at the sow barn level? So what would be some tips and techniques, if you would, to kind of help our farm staff understand what's coming into their barns from,
Sure.
fertility and genetic capability and so forth?
Yeah. So firstly, most boar studs today won't be shipping out semen that's bad. They don't mean to ship out bad semen, but that doesn't mean that you are getting good semen either. It could, remember that transportation time point. So it's always good to look at the sperm motility when you receive it. Take the temperature of the gel packs that were with the semen, as well as the temperature of the semen when it arrives. Recording that every day at a minimum, if you're not going to look at motility, would be very good. But then if you do get a chance to look at motility, just make sure you're keeping aware of how that extender works with the semen. Ask the boar stud what kind of extender they're using, if they'll tell you, and how they recommend looking at motility, because different extenders warm up differently. Some of them out there need 20 minutes to warm up to 37C before you can check the motility properly. And so oftentimes people will look at the motility right out of the incubator and they don't look very motile. Well, that's because the semen extenders were made so that they would conserve the energy. And you won't really see that until they warm up.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. What about the difference between shipped semen and maybe semen that was just transported in a courier that morning? Are there any differences that we should be aware of? Any challenges there?
Sure. So ideally, the carrier will have a better temperature storage and whatnot. When you're having it shipped overnight, they're typically increase the number of cells in that dose because we know that there may not be the exact temperature that we need. A lot of these extenders have more forgiveness than we give them credit for in shipment, especially the better extenders out there on the market. They have all kinds of antioxidants and membrane protectors. So just to say that overnight shipped semen isn't as good as carrier, sure, but the semen extenders are quite good today in protecting us for that. So that's the main difference in those two scenarios.
And I saw we certainly have seen the length of the extenders as far as how long we can use semen extend further and further. So I think that's a very good point. Anything else that our listeners should be thinking about in terms of boars? Because again, most of us don't really see the boar. We just get the packages in. And I think it's important, one, if you're in the boar studs, to to hear of practices and things we should be thinking about, but then also on the sow farm level, things to think about. So any other tips or tricks you want to share with us today?
Yeah, I think mainly definitely take the temperature of the semen when it arrives. If that's the one thing you take away from this conversation, recording the temperature upon arrival, that way you have a log to go back to and some easy way of looking at it. Boar studs oftentimes will look at the motility multiple days afterwards and make a phone call if the motility is going down, in case you don't get to look at it yourself. But I think the main takeaway is that we're all in this together. And so sometimes there's pushback of decreasing the sperm cells on the per dose side. But let's keep in mind for the entire picture that decreasing the sperm dose allows us to get better genetic leverage, use those higher end boars, and ultimately finish better. And the total economics of the situation is favorable for that. And so going on in the future, I know no one wants to see their numbers change and whatnot, but it's the team approach. We'll have to continue to push the lever there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What about how often we should send semen out for third-party evaluations or documentations of effectiveness?
Sure. Yeah. So that's I would get in touch with these third-party testing sites, and they have good recommendations for that. Sometimes they'll just have you do spot checking. And so you can either have that sent directly from the boar stud you're working with, or you can ship it from your own facility. One thing to keep in mind if you're shipping it from your own facility is that we had one stressing event that the semen extenders usually can hold the sperm up for, but putting them into a second stressful event, shipping them from the sow farm, isn't as ideal. So I understand the desire to be like spontaneous checking and not letting your boar stud know, but at the same time, you're likely to get worse results because they're going through that second shipping event. So definitely try to work with your boar stud to do that if you wanted to do that, and that's the main thing I would say on that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something that some of our audience may not understand is what the third party group does. Because I know when I've worked with them in the past, they will hold semen for 5, 6, 7 days or longer based on what extender they're using and retest that throughout. Is there anything else that our audience should be thinking about that the third party groups can do besides the immediate, I'm going to check motility, morphology, and verify that they've got a good dose?
So I would definitely be checking some of these biomarkers out. We know that even though the semen after day 5, day 6, they look like they're motile, they have good motility. The problem with it is that they have a shortened lifespan because they've gone through early stages of sperm capacitation. And that's basically to say, like, if you had a firework and you lit it, that fuse is even shorter. And so they still have motility and everything, but they won't last as long after we inseminate with them. And so if you're wanting to use semen that's a little bit older, make sure the extenders are supporting the long-term shelf life beyond the motility that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Which biomarkers would you consider?
Yeah, so I would definitely acrosome status. So oftentimes that's using a lectin PNA, but also looking at plasma membrane integrity, zinc localization as well, and calcium. Those are the main 4, I would say.
Wonderful. Well, Karl, I think you've given us a lot of good insight, and I know we've kind of jumped around a little bit between what boar studs are doing and what we can do at the sow farm, and of course we hit a little bit on nutrition. We didn't really talk much about health. I think in general we expect our boars to be negative for a lot of diseases, and with the filtration we would anticipate that they stay that way, and then routine testing, of course, to lead into that. Is there anything else on the health side that I'm missing that we should be discussing today?
Oh, oftentimes boar studs are testing regularly. We know that that's the tip top of the pyramid for health status. And so a lot of them are either pooling semen together so that they can see if an entire sample is negative. And then if they do get a positive, they can dissect that pool out and see which boar is positive for whatever disease of choice we're looking after. But I would talk with the boar stud that you're working with and make sure they are testing. And if not, finding ways that you can get your semen tested before you use it. Yeah.
So one last question I have for you is in the south side, because that's of course the part of the production system that I like to talk about a lot. We've been dealing a lot with prolapses, as you know, discussions around 𝘮𝘂𝗲𝘀, late finishing lameness. And so is there anything that's kind of popping up on the boar side that we as an industry should be mindful of that we need to be addressing?
Yeah, there's some really exciting science coming out on that side. And so not all of it's published yet. Some of it's being peer reviewed. So I don't want to allude to what that's coming out. But we should probably be keeping in mind that every time we're inseminating, we're also perhaps changing the microbiota environment. We're introducing new bacteria from the boar stud and from the boar itself. We're introducing antibiotics that could be really skewing the microbiota environment. So I think there's some exciting things that will be coming out on that in the future, and definitely some low-hanging fruit that people are identifying.
Perfect. Well, we'll definitely keep our eyes out for that.
Yeah.
Well, as we kind of wrap up today, we'd like to ask our guest speaker a few extra questions. I know I've bombarded you with a bunch already, but we have 3 that we like to ask every guest speaker. The first one is really around, do you have a swine resource book that you kind of consider your go-to when you have questions?
Yeah, sadly, we don't have a good swine resource for the boar side. If I think of basics, going back to morphology, Dr. 𝘮𝘂𝗲𝗀 from Queen's University in Canada has a nice bull morphology book. And so usually that's where I start people out at. And bull sperm and boar sperm have a lot of the same deformities. And so oftentimes I go to the cattle side for that.
So maybe I hear a potential book in the future that you're going to author, right?
Yeah, we need to do that.
Yeah. So how about in your spare time? Are there any books that you would recommend to our readers that aren't related to pigs?
Sure. So I'm a big Tim Ferriss fan. So Tim Ferriss has his own podcast as well as a series of books, whether it's a 4-Hour Work Week or 4-Hour Body, or Tools for Titans, particularly with Tools for Titans, where he interviews high-level performers and CEOs and just gets an idea of what does their normal day look like, what routines work well for them. So I really appreciate looking at all the advice that Tim Ferriss has curated together.
Mm-hmm. That's a great resource for our audience. Thank you for that one. Lastly, we like to ask you if you think about somebody who you in your mind you've defined as successful. So somebody in the industry that you in your mind can picture as successful. What key characteristic or trait stands out about them that you think has helped them become successful?
Yeah, so I think being able to future cast and see what is the consumer wanting, what is the consumer needing, and then how do we work backwards from that? And so we always need to keep in mind we're creating a product, that product being pork, and ultimately that the judge is the consumer, whether they're going to buy beef, whether they're going to buy chicken or pork underneath the case. And we know that the center of the cut pork is not a high number, less than 2 per year. Less than 2 meals per year people are eating for pork as center of the cut outside of breakfast. And so anyone that can look forward to future casting and looking at what the consumer wants, I have great respect for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've heard that one a lot lately, is the forward thinkers and the people who can think outside the box just a little bit to push people forward has been a very popular thought around what makes people successful. Well, I do want to thank you again for your time. I know you're a busy individual, so thank you for your insight. From what I hear today, we need to be thinking about biomarkers, whether it's biomarkers to predict which boars are going to be successful in the breeding barns, or biomarkers to help us understand how well the semen is doing in terms of storage and proper use after collection. So I think that's really insightful, and it gives us a lot to think about. So thank you again, Dr. Kerns, for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding, by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.